I'm extremely happy to be introducing Rupert tonight. He's someone I've known for a long time and has been really an inspiration to me and lots of people around me, so it's fantastic that Rupert's here. The title for the talk tonight is Morphic Resonance, which is an idea that Rupert, I'm sure he'll unpack it more as the talk goes on, but it's an idea that Rupert started to look at in his early career when he was studying microbiology in Cambridge and doing research. And he started to understand that some of the orthodox models of science that he had been handed down maybe weren't enough to explain what he was observing in the laboratory and outside the laboratory. So following that, he went to India, where he lived and worked, I believe, on the ashram of Bede Griffiths for some time to try and look for other models that he could use to explain some of the things he was seeing. And it was there that he wrote his first book on morphic resonance, which I'm going to try to summarize very briefly as being essentially the idea that there are fields of influence that start to have an impact on us and the natural world around us. So fields of influence that, for example, affect the way that things grow, affect things like evolution and even consciousness. I was having a conversation with a student a few years ago, and this subject came up. She was doing a project on what she called the architectural exposome. So the exposome, as some of you will know, is a sort of body that sits outside of the body that starts to affect it, and that we in return can start to affect back again. The way she did this was by looking at the facade of buildings. And we think of facades traditionally as being the element that encloses, that keeps things out or allows things in. But in fact, of course, when you start looking at them more closely, we start to recognize that the facade of the building is much more porous than we might first think. So we know that it lets light in and it lets light out, temperature in and out. Different various sounds as well move across the facade of the building. So immediately she started to define the architectural body as being something that was far more porous and less isolated. It was something that was under the influence of things beyond it. She then did a wonderful flip in the project where she started, rather like a biologist, looking at the architectural body, not at the scale of 1 to 1, but at the scale of 10,000 to 1, where in fact you start to see all sorts of other living entities that start to interact with buildings, so the microbial, the bacterial, the fungal. And in fact, with that, what you end up with is ending up a much sort of fuzzier edge to the building. That, in fact, the idea of a hard delineated edge was rather a sort of fake construct that we might perceive. She did something very nice as well. She then flipped this round in the other direction and started looking at buildings at the scale of 1 to 10,000 or 1 to 100,000. So maybe on the scale of the city, on the scale of the territory, on the scale of the biosphere. And in doing that, you start to realize that there are these fields of influence that start to play out in the architectural body. So whether this is legislation or whether it's to do with material extraction, where you're taking large bodies of material from different places in the world and putting them back together in the form of buildings, whether it's the energy required to do that in the extraction and the production of architecture. And of course, also at the other end, at the death of a building, when the materials then start to return back into the world and get placed back out there. So I'm very aware that a lot of what I've just described in that example definitely belong to the sort of mechanistic view of the world. However, this notion of fields of influence that Rupert talks about with morphic resonance, I think is something that we can all relate to, and when you start looking for it, it's absolutely everywhere. Rupert's work has then gone on to continue looking at morphic resonance in different contexts, and I think it's manifested itself in many different ways through numerous books and papers, lots of very rigorous research, dialogues and trialogues with people from many different disciplines, and very often formulated around playful and provocative questions. So how can we communicate with our non-human kin? Is the sun conscious? These are the types of questions that I'm hoping we're going to hear a little bit more about tonight in the talk. So without much further ado, over to Rupert. Thank you very much, Rupert.
Well, thank you, Inigo. Can you all hear me? Yes. Is it working? Oh, good. I'm going to talk about morphic resonance, which is an idea about memory in nature. It's in its most general form, it suggests that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. Instead of the universe being governed by a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code that was present at the moment of the Big Bang, it's governed by evolving habits. And once things have been repeated many times, they behave as if they're governed by eternal laws. But where we see the differences with new phenomena, you can actually see the habits build up, I suggest. The hypothesis suggests that every species has a kind of collective memory. Every giraffe draws upon a giraffe collective memory, both of form, shaping the embryonic development of the baby giraffe, and of instinct. And we too, I think, draw on a collective human memory, similar to what the psychologist Jung called the collective unconscious. So this is a rather radical idea, and perhaps its most radical implication, the one that's most shocking and controversial within science, is that even our own memories depend on morphic resonance. They're not stored inside our brains. We've all been brought up with the idea that memories are stored somewhere inside the head. Everything you remember about what you did last year on holiday, or all the skills you've learned, everything you've learned somehow is supposed to be coded in some molecular or cellular form inside the brain. Despite 100 years of research, no one's been able to find these memory traces, and I think the reason is that they're not there. I think the brain works in a completely different way. So I'll come on to that. But needless to say, this is a controversial hypothesis. It's a hypothesis, which means it's a guess about the way things might be. And within science, the procedure is to have a guess about the way things might be and then to test it to see whether the evidence supports or refutes the hypothesis. The idea of memory in nature is very unfamiliar in the West because our philosophy has been shaped very much by the Greek tradition, and especially by Plato, the idea that there are eternal forms or ideas outside space and time which govern everything in nature. And this took root in the foundations of science in the 17th century with the idea of nature being governed by eternal laws, which were originally thought of as ideas in the mind of a mathematical god. Most scientists now, at least in Western countries, have rubbed out God from their worldview, but they're left with free-floating eternal laws transcending space and time, a legacy of this 17th century theology. That's the main reason there's a deep opposition to morphic resonance. People are so used to, got into the habit of thinking in terms of eternal laws. And this is, most scientists don't think about this question at all, in fact. They just take it for granted. But it underlies the basic assumption of the scientific method that any experiment should be repeatable at any time, anywhere, because the laws of nature are everywhere and always the same. This is the cast of mind that we've all grown up with here in the West. But in Oriental philosophies, particularly in Hinduism and in many schools of Buddhism, it's been taken for granted for thousands of years that there's a kind of memory in nature. And this became particularly clear to me when I was living in India. I thought of the idea of morphic resonance, first of all, when I was at Don in Cambridge. In fact, I thought of it, incredibly enough, in 1973, exactly 50 years ago. And when I discussed it with my colleagues in Cambridge, especially those in the biochemistry department, it met with incredulity and then mockery. But when I discussed it with my colleagues in India, where I worked in an international agricultural institute, most of my Indian colleagues, Hindu colleagues at least, said, well, of course, there is nothing new in this idea. Ancient rishis have said all this thousands of years ago. And they were completely blasé about it. So I realized what a huge cultural difference in this most fundamental worldview there is. Anyway, it's a testable hypothesis rather than philosophy. And that means you can do experiments to find out whether it fits the way nature is or not. And it applies not only to living organisms, but also to crystals and molecules. So the theory predicts, for example, that if you make a new compound for the very first time and crystallize it, the crystal form will not have existed before. So there won't be morphic resonance from past crystals of that type that govern its crystallization. A new form will have to come into being. It may take time. But the next time you crystallize the same compound, it'll be influenced by the first crystals and should crystallize somewhat more easily. The third time, easier still, because of influences from the first and second crystals, and so on. So things should get easier to crystallize all around the world. In fact, they do. New compounds get easier to crystallize all around the world. It's well known to chemists. But they don't explain it in terms of morphic resonance. They usually explain it away in terms of the transfer of little bits of previous crystals from lab to lab on the beards or clothing of migrant chemists, or else in terms of invisible dust particles that have been wafted around in the atmosphere. But the facts are there. And the theory also predicts that the melting points of new crystals should go up. The more often they're crystallized, the more stable they'll become, the harder to disrupt. And the melting point of new crystals and new compounds does amazingly go up. I summarize this evidence in the appendix to my book, A New Science of Life, the third edition, where I give the details. I'm not giving a technical seminar this evening, so I'm not going to go into all the technical evidence. The theory also applies to the development of animals and plants. The more often they develop in a particular way, the easier it should become for them to develop that way again. And applies to learning. If you train rats to learn a new trick in London, rats all over the world should be able to learn the same trick more quickly just because they've learned it here. Now, there is actually evidence for that from experiments with rats. In a famous series of experiments begun at Harvard, a psychologist called McDougall trained rats to escape from a water maze and measured how many errors they took before they got it right. They made a large number of errors to start with. You can see that there's a screen over there. With subsequent generations, the number of errors got less and less and less, until it was down to about 25 from over 200. Now, you could say that this was an epigenetic effect. It was the children of the trained rats that got better. But this was still a very, very surprising result at the time, because it shows an inheritance of acquired characters, which in 20th century biology was completely taboo. Children couldn't inherit what parents had learned, according to the neo-Darwinist theory. So his results were very controversial, and people tried replicating them in Melbourne, Australia, and in Edinburgh. They used the same rats, the same water maze, same kind of rats, and their rats started off more or less where the Harvard rats left off, and much quicker than the Harvard rats had been to start with. And moreover, the researchers in Australia did a control line, and they found that this improvement was not just in the descendants of trained rats, but all rats of that breed were showing this improvement, even if their parents had never been trained. So this is just the kind of effect you would expect with morphic resonance. This should be applying in the human realm as well. And let me first say that there's evidence that this actually works in animal evolution. There's one well-known example is of blue tits, small birds that many of you will be familiar with from your garden, that in the 1920s developed a habit of stealing the cream from the top of milk bottles. This habit first appeared in Southampton, and it spread and started popping up in other places. And some scientists at Cambridge documented the spread by enlisting thousands and thousands of amateur bird watchers. And what they found was that the habit spread when it's turned up more than 60 miles from a previous occurrence, they worked out it was an independent invention because blue tits are home-loving birds and don't move very far. And the rate of independent invention increased, as you see from these maps. So what was happening was that they'd learned to tear off the top of the milk bottle and steal the cream. And then more and more blue tits all over the country started doing it. When milk deliveries stopped during the war, they couldn't do it anymore. And after the war, the earlier pre-war generation of blue tits that remembered the golden age of free cream had died out. But when milk deliveries started again, blue tits very quickly cottoned on, and it happened all over the country much faster than it had the first time round. It also showed up in Holland, and again, after the war, resumed very quickly. Interestingly, this pattern of spread of behaviour has now undergone a further change, because when I first was living in London, we got full cream milk delivered to our doorstep by the milkman. We still have milk deliveries every day in Hampstead. But no, not every day, but twice a week now. But we switched to semi-skimmed milk, like lots of other people. And there was no free cream at the top of the bottle. And this habit simply died out. And it now hardly exists because so many people have switched to semi-skimmed milk. So you can't actually see this going on anymore. Anyway, I think that's an example of morphic resonance in an evolutionary context. And in the human realm, I think it's happening all the time. It should be getting easier to learn windsurfing, snowboarding, computer programming, etc. All these various skills that we have. And indeed, most of them are getting easier to learn. But of course, as you'll instantly think, well, that could be because of improved training methods, more videos showing you how to do it, etc., etc. Cultural factors which also change. And that's true. See, it's very hard to disentangle morphic resonance from all the other things that are going on. To do that, you really need to have standardized tests that have been done the same way for long periods of time. And when I was first thinking about these ideas, I realized that IQ tests would be ideal for this because they involve standard puzzle-solving problems that have been done over many decades. And so I worked out that IQ tests should be getting easier to do, not because people are getting smarter, more intelligent, but because so many people have already done the tests, and the tests should be getting easier. And in fact, in the late 1980s, a psychologist called James Flynn discovered that exactly that had been going on. Here you see a graph showing average IQs in the United States from 1918 onwards. There was something like a 30% increase in IQ. It's called the Flynn effect, after Flynn. But no independent evidence that Americans had got 30% smarter. And similar effects occurred in at least 14 other countries, so it wasn't just the US. So I think that's an example of morphic resonance. It's not difficult to design experiments to test it. And in fact, my older son, Merlin, when he was 16, inadvertently designed one because he came to me one day and said that he and his friends, he was very excited. He said, my friends and I have thought of a way of getting extra marks in GCSE exams without doing extra work. So I thought, well, that sounds very good. How are you going to do that? And he said, by morphic resonance. He said, in the physics paper, there are 12 questions. He said, we're going to do questions 11 and 12 first, and then we'll be about 10 minutes behind everyone else in Britain for all the other questions, so we should get a boost by morphic resonance. Well, they all got A stars. I mean, they were smart anyway, so again, it wasn't a conclusive proof, but it turned out that an old friend of mine from Cambridge was in charge of the RSA GCSE science exams. So I pointed out to him that just by changing the order of questions in a subset of papers, he could turn our entire national science exam system into a massive test of morphic resonance. He showed a flickering of interest and enthusiasm to start with, but a couple of days later he got in touch with me and said, "Rupert, I just can't do it." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, I'm due to retire soon and I want to make sure I get a full pension." He said, "If I turn our science exam system into a giant morphic resonance experiment, that's not going to happen." So unfortunately it didn't happen. But a wonderful opportunity has recently cropped up with the 5-letter word game called Wordle that many of you will be familiar with. I'm familiar with it because my wife is very addicted to it. And every day there's a new 5-letter puzzle, and you have 5 attempts. I'm sure many of you have done it. But the point is that there's a new puzzle every single day. By morphic resonance, I would expect that people would find the puzzle easier to do in the evening than in the morning. And I've carried out online surveys of people who do Wordle, and that seems to be the case. This follows on from work I did earlier with crossword puzzles, because this theory predicts that many people who do the Times crossword puzzle have told me this, that they find it easier to do the next day than if they do it the morning it comes out, because so many people have already done it. So the Wordle is owned by the New York Times. So I wrote to the New York Times Games Department asking if I could have access to their daily Wordle data to see if there's a trend every day for the people to solve it quicker as time goes on. And I thought that would be a very simple and interesting thing. But they wrote, they're terrible spoil sports, and they wrote back saying that at this time we're not interested in this project. I think the head of games has got an easy life, a comfortable job, it goes on routinely. But if suddenly the New York Times word puzzle became the center of a scientific storm of controversy about morphic resonance, her life would no longer be follow a predictable and easy course. And I think she was just taking the easy way out. Anyway, it's frustrating. There's all this data, not only from Wordle, but from Octordle and Quordle and so on, just lying there in the archives, which could reveal morphic resonance in daily life going on right now. Anyway, the point of all this is to suggest, to show you that this is a testable hypothesis. And the idea of morphic resonance is that for patterns of activity in living systems are all rhythmic. All living systems, and indeed non-living systems, atoms and molecules, they're all rhythmically vibratory patterns. Matter is no longer thought of as stuff, as it used to be in the 19th century, but as a process. An electron is whizzing around a nucleus in an atom. The nucleus itself is pulsating with activity as the various particles oscillate within it. And molecules are vibratory structures. So everything is vibratory. We ourselves have many different rhythms, heartbeats, breathing rates, brain waves, all sorts of very quick rhythms in our cells, biochemical rhythms, daily rhythms of sleeping and waking. That everything in nature is that's self-organizing. This doesn't apply to machines. It applies to self-organizing systems, atoms, molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, societies of organisms like flocks of birds, solar systems, galaxies. All self-organizing systems, I'm suggesting, have rhythmic or activities which are organized by what I call morphic fields. And morphic resonance is based on similarity from the past to the present. There's an influence from similar past systems on present systems across time. Morphic resonance is a resonance across time. It doesn't have to go to be stored in a material form in between. That's why you don't need memory traces. We're very used to memory being stored in books, in computer disks, in magnetic tapes, and so forth. So we think of memory being in a place. But what I'm suggesting is the fundamental nature of memory is not to be in a place. Memory is a relationship in time, and morphic resonance is a connection, direct connection across time. Well, this has many implications in many areas of science and life. One of them is in inheritance. We inherit many characteristics from our ancestors, so do plants and animals and microbes and fungi. And in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, it was almost universally assumed that all of inheritance could be explained in terms of genes. And genes acquired an enormously high status in science, and molecular biology, and particularly molecular genetics, became the dominant force in biology. And this tied in with the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, which is all about the selection of genes. And of course, the whole of this idea was very persuasively popularized by Richard Dawkins in his famous book, The Selfish Gene. So the gene-centered theory of inheritance was completely dominant. When I put forward these ideas of morphic resonance, it was very hard to make any impact on people's thinking, because everyone thought it's all in the genes and we'll soon have figured out every single detail of it within 10 or 20 years. Whereas what I'm saying is that genes code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins. This is what we know they actually do. And some are involved in controlling the switching on and switching off other genes. Some are involved in producing RNA molecules that can have various effects in the cell. But they don't code for shapes, forms, and instincts. Genes don't directly code for the shape of your arm or your legs. In fact, your arms and your legs contain exactly the same genes and exactly the same chemicals, but they're arranged in a different way. Just as all the buildings in Bedford Square are made of similar building materials, bricks, mortar, steel or reinforcing bars, roofing materials, etc. But their architectural structures are somewhat different. And if you go to a suburb, then the different houses are very different from each other, even though the building materials are the same. So that's why architects exist, to have architectural plans for buildings. And I think that the fields, morphic fields, the form-shaping fields of organisms are giving them their form. And that's inherited by morphic resonance. So the shape of your arms and legs is given by the morphic fields for arms and legs, not by the genes or the proteins, which are the same in both. They're chemically identical. So I don't think instincts or forms are inherited through genes. Well, it was very hard to get that view across in the 80s because genes, I thought, were grossly overrated, but most people didn't think that. Well, when the Human Genome Project was finally completed in the year 2000, people thought they'd have now, through the human genome, knowing every single gene, complete knowledge of human nature at the molecular level. It didn't turn out quite like that. In fact, the whole genome project, although technically an impressive achievement, was very disappointing. To investors who'd put billions and billions of dollars into it, it was very disappointing indeed. The head of Cellular Genomics, the private genome company that sequenced the genome, Craig Venter, saw the share price collapse from about $60 a share to about 15 cents. In fact, when interviewed soon after this, he said, "I'm a guy who's made $1 million the hard way by working my way down from $1 billion." So the genome project was very disappointing. And when people then sequenced tens of thousands of genomes and did what are called genome-wide association studies, it turned out that the genes actually explain very little of inheritance. Studies on the inheritance of height, for example, showed that about 50 genes were involved. Together they explained about 10% of the inheritance of height, rather than 80 or 90%, which is what people had expected. They've now found more genes that are involved with height and made it somewhat more accurate. But even so, there's a big gap between what the genes explain and what is inherited. And this is called, in biology, it's called the missing heritability problem. And it's a massive crisis within biology that the genetic explanation of inheritance simply hasn't worked out the way people thought it would. Nor have the total number of genes worked out as people thought. It turns out that sea urchins have about twice as many genes as we do, and rice plants about 3 times as many, and fruit flies we've got about 20,000, fruit flies have about 17,000. So the idea that we'd have the most genes of any other organism, people had expected 100,000 or so, turned out not to be true, and our genome is about 99% identical to that of chimpanzees. So whatever makes us different from chimpanzees isn't very adequately explained by genes. So this was a huge shock. And inheritance then, the study of inheritance took another turn around the year 2000, when the ban or taboo on the inheritance of acquired characters, Lamarckian inheritance, was transcended through the recognition that acquired characters can be inherited. Organisms can inherit adaptations from their parents in plants and animals. It's been rebranded epigenetic inheritance, and this is now a major area of research in biology, over and above the genes. So everyone now agrees that the genes were grossly overrated, and that epigenetic inheritance plays a part, modifications of the genes, switching them on and off in a way that can be inherited. But even that still leaves a large amount unexplained, and that, I think, is what morphic resonance is doing. There are some experiments going on right now to look at epigenetic inheritance in nematode worms with morphic resonance controls to see how much of this epigenetic inheritance is actually morphic resonance rather than molecular changes. And it's been assumed that it can all be explained by molecular modifications of genes. But actually, a lot of it may involve morphic resonance. And for the first time, those experiments are going on right now with promising results. So anyway, these are testable aspects, these are in relation to inheritance. Morphic resonance also applies to twins because it depends on similarity. The hypothesis predicts that identical twins should be very resonant with each other, even if they're brought up in adopted by different families, separated soon after birth, and adopted by separate families. And as you know, a lot of the foundations of the study of genetics has been based on identical twin studies. If the nature of the twins is determined primarily by environment, then they should be very different if they're raised by very different adoptive families. If it's by genetics, they should be very similar. And the results show they're very similar. And they have similar characteristics, similar proneness to diseases, even similar hobbies and similar favorite colors, much more similar than anyone would have expected, actually. And so the usual conclusion from this is, aha, well, that just shows it's all in the genes. And that's the normal, that evidence from identical twins has done a great deal to boost the whole ideology of genes and genetic determinism. However, the debate so far has simply ignored morphic resonance. And with morphic resonance, you would actually expect twins, because they're similar, to share many characteristics in common which are not in the genes. They'd be resonating with each other across time and space, even in separate families, even if they don't know of the other one's existence. And so I think that provides a new way of understanding the identical twin data, which also makes a lot of sense of the missing heritability problem, because the reason people expected so much inheritance, so much heritability to be in the genes was because of these identical twin studies. And if it turns out they're actually more about morphic resonance than genes, then the whole thing becomes much easier to understand. If you ask the question, who in the past was most similar to me, then the answer is me. We're all more similar to ourselves in the past than to anyone else. So on the basis of morphic resonance, we should be specifically influenced by morphic resonance from our own past. And that's, I think, how memory works. I think the reason that we have our own memories rather than other people's is because we're so similar to ourselves in the past. But we're also similar to a whole range of other people as well, and that is then the collective memory that Jung was talking about. So individual memory and collective memory both depend on resonance, but one is more specific than the other. So there's a difference of degree, not of kind. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there have been numerous attempts to find memory traces, physical traces of memory, and they've been foiled over and over and over again. The latest iteration of that is is evidence that came out in the last 9 months, where people found that when rodents, like mice, remembered a particular task, there was a very particular pattern of wave activity in their brain, which could be measured with very fine electrodes. And this wave pattern was characteristic of what they were remembering. And then when the rodents remembered the same thing again, you got the same wave pattern. So people at first said, well, there you are, this proves there are memory traces that underlie the wave pattern. But actually, when they looked in more detail, although it was the same wave pattern, it wasn't on the same part of the brain. It had moved to a different part of the brain, and every time they measured it, it could sort of shift around. What mattered was the wave pattern, which I would say is the basis of the resonance of memory, not the actual cells. And this phenomenon, which is very puzzling from the point of view of conventional memory theory, is called representational drift. The representation, which is given by these waves, seems to drift around the brain. So these are hot areas of debate within science, and I personally think that the seeing memory in terms of morphic resonance would make so much better sense of the available data, but it's not something you can talk about within regular neuroscience institutes, except after dark or in private, because the taboos in science are very, very strong. Anyway, so now let's come on to how morphic resonance in more detail as to how it interfaces with form. I started all this not through reading Oriental philosophy or anything like that, but through working on developmental biology at Cambridge, where I was working on the development of plant form. We still don't understand how a leaf or a flower takes up its particular shape. We know, everyone agrees that genes are involved in making the right proteins and enzymes that make cellulose cell walls and so forth. There are certain hormones in plants that have a major influence on development, like the plant hormone auxin, which I used to work on myself. But since the 1920s, there's been the idea that living organisms are shaped by invisible fields called morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields. Morpho from the Greek word morphe, form, genesis from the Greek word coming into being. Fields concerned with the coming into being of form. Molecular biologists aren't very interested in morphogenetic fields because theirs is an attempt to have a bottom-up, gene-up, molecular-up theory of explanation, whereas morphogenetic fields are top-down. There's a field for the whole system, a holistic field that governs what happens. It's like the difference between trying to understand a building by analyzing the bricks and cement and building materials, thinking that if you do enough of that, you'll understand the building, or looking at the plan of the building, and which would, of course, give you an immediate overview of why it is as it is. And I think that you need this field approach, because you'll never arrive at the understanding the whole through just analyzing the parts. Fields are a well-established concept in science, and just to remind you, here's a magnetic field. Faraday first named fields here in London in the 1840s, and what he meant by a field was a region of influence. The region of influence of the magnetic field is around the magnet. It's within the magnet and around the magnet. In empty or invisible space, you have fields, which are shapes or structures. Invisible, they're not material. Matter's made of fields. Fields are not made of matter. At first, in the 19th century, people thought fields were made of matter, subtle matter called the ether. But in Einstein's special theory of relativity, he showed the ether doesn't exist. Fields are just free-floating forms. As Faraday and Einstein, quoting him, said, they are modifications of mere space. Now, you may think this is a kind of occult or peculiar notion, but actually it's totally mainstream in science. The gravitational field is why it's holding us down to the floor right now. That's why we're not floating around in this room. And it's invisible. It stretches out far beyond the Earth, keeps the moon in its orbit. The electromagnetic fields which underlie light, which is an electromagnetic vibration, and travels through the electromagnetic field from the most distant parts of the universe. That's why we can see distant stars and galaxies with powerful telescopes. This is an electromagnetic field. It's invisible. This room is full of invisible mobile phone transmissions, TV and radio transmissions. You can't see any of them. They're invisible. So the idea of invisible fields may have sounded really peculiar in the 18th century, but in the 21st century, the whole of science is based on the idea of invisible fields. In fact, one could argue that modern science is in the business of explaining the visible in terms of the invisible. So the idea of morphogenetic fields, as proposed in the 1920s by developmental biologists, and as I think still remains true, is that they're invisible shapes or patterns which influence developing organisms, shaping how they develop. And I think that the fields contain or work through vibratory patterns, that how they do it through vibrations. As you may know, vibration can induce form. These are some patterns in a small, about 2 centimeter wide cylindrical container of water, excited at different frequencies, which show different patterns. The one on the left shows at the top left, 6-fold, 8-fold, 10-fold, 12-fold, 14, 16, 18, and 20-fold patterns. Just add vibration, and the water takes up these very different forms. These are some patterns that produced by myself and my son Merlin. We have a laboratory at home where we look at vibratory forms, and these are some of our results from our cymoscope, which is the device for vibrating fluids at different frequencies. These are very simple models, but they show you that form can come about through vibration almost instantly. Form doesn't have to be caused, as most biologists still think of it, in terms of molecules trundling along diffusion pathways and slowly setting up interfering patterns of chemical diffusion and so on. They're terribly clunky, these biological models. They leave out vibration almost entirely. And yet vibration is an enormously powerful formative principle, and I think it's how morphic fields work. The word morphic field is a generic term that applies to form-shaping fields, morphogenetic fields. The fields that affect behavior through the brain and nervous system, behavioral fields, the fields that affect social organization, like flocks of birds, all of these are morphic fields, of which morphogenetic fields are one species, as it were. So what I'm suggesting is that these morphic fields shape organisms, and they shape even single-celled organisms where genes can't possibly explain it. If you switch on and off genes, then they'd be the same in a single-celled organism. They wouldn't explain the form. Many biologists try to explain form by saying, well, these cells have this gene switched on and these have a different gene switched on. But there's much, much more to it than that, because the fields are organized in a hierarchical structure. Here we have the outer circle could be a tissue. The smaller ones could be cells within those organelles, and the same would apply, this pattern of organization, to subatomic particles in atoms, in molecules, in crystals. The whole of nature is organized through a nested level of hierarchies, each of which has its own morphic field, according to this hypothesis. It's a part of a general holistic philosophy of nature. If we look at single-celled organisms like radiolarians, each of these has a silicaceous skeleton, which you can see in the picture, but different species have completely different shapes. And somehow a single cell has to be able to make those different shapes. It no doubt requires genes, the right genes to be switched on, but the genes themselves can't explain why these have different shapes. And that, I think, is because they have different morphic fields shaping the vibratory pattern of the developing cells. Here's a famous picture of radiolarians by Ernst Haeckel, the 19th century biologist, who produced some really beautiful pictures of biological systems. These are pollen grains, which are, again, single cells. Different species have different shaped pollen grains, showing the range of morphogenetic forms in single cells. This is an alga called Acetambularia. Each of these is a single cell with a cap and a stalk. They're about 2 inches big. They're enormous cells. And these, again, are single cells which take on these complex forms, even though the genes and the proteins are the same throughout the cell. And this is the embryo of a bat, showing you how, as multicellular organisms develop, all the different structures and organs form within them. And I think that's because of the morphogenetic fields of the organs, within those the fields of the tissues, the field of the whole organism, coordinating them all. Now, these fields have a capacity that mechanical systems don't have, which is a holistic property, which enables them to regenerate. Here you see a dragonfly egg. The one on the right was tied with a thread, and the top half was killed. The bottom half of it, which would normally give rise to the posterior of the embryo, now gives rise to a small but complete embryo, showing a holistic property. You would never get this with any kind of machine. If you cut a computer in half, all you get is a broken computer. Whereas these field phenomena are intrinsically holistic. If you cut a magnet in half, you don't get one north pole and one south pole. You get 2 magnets, each with a north and a south pole. So there's a feature of fields is this holistic property which organizes self-organizing systems. This shows flatworms planaria cut into different bits, and each bit can regenerate into a new worm. This shows legs of a salamander which were amputated at different. On the left, they were amputated in the forelimb, and on the right, in the part of the limb nearest the body. But wherever you amputate it, they're able to regrow the rest of the leg and regenerate a leg. And this shows some experiments done with a newt. In this case, the lens was artificially, surgically removed from the eye, and the eye then regenerates a new lens from the edge of the iris. But in normal newt development, the eye develops by folding in on skin from the outside. It doesn't develop from the iris at all. So there's an ability to adapt in a seemingly intelligent way to regenerate forms. It would be very, very difficult to explain this without a field theory, both to account for the wholeness of it and also for the way in which it can move towards a final goal or an attractor, which these field models include, but which rather clunky mechanistic models of molecular interactions don't. So anyway, this is just a few words about morphogenetic fields. And I think that similar fields organize the activity of brains. I think similar fields organize the activity of social groups, like flocks of birds or termite colonies. All of these fields, organizing fields, spread out in space, working on the parts within them, coordinating them together, and giving them their form, shape, and structure, and enabling them to regenerate in the case of injury. Of course, not all injury can be followed by regeneration, but even in our own bodies, we can regenerate quite a lot. Our skin regenerates after damage, our liver regenerates, our blood cells are continually being regenerated. These are some of the ways in which morphic resonance and morphic fields, I think, apply in biology and also in the formation of molecules and crystals. Now, these ideas, I think, have a wider relevance, and I'll just talk about a few of the implications. The main bridge between this way of thinking and architecture, which I know at least some of you here are architects or budding architects, is clearly there's an overlap in talking about form and the nature of form. And the architectural theorists that I myself find the closest affinity with, you may or may not learn about in your courses here, is Christopher Alexander, who wrote a book called A Pattern Language, where he shows that many architectural motifs, like the frames around windows, the way that you have a kind of reiteration of forms, of lines and moldings and things which you see in traditional architectural forms, are common in many different cultures, and they're a way of marking out boundaries by marking them out through over and over again so that it's unmistakable that we're dealing with a boundary. He deals with some of these archetypal patterns found in buildings all around the world, which are, I think, like morphic forms in our minds. I don't think the window itself has a morphic field, it's not self-organizing, but in our minds, the archetypal forms which are expressed through architecture, I think are basic forms or morphic fields in our minds. He also wrote a 4-volume work called The Nature of Order, which is a very remarkable work and shows a very deep understanding of the nature of form and order, not just in architecture, but also in biology and in natural phenomena. So there may have been other theorists since Alexander who've done this, but of all the ones I've come across, he's the one who makes the closest bridge between this way of thinking about architecture and morphic fields, morphic resonance. He and I met once in Berkeley where he was teaching, and we got on really well, and I think there was a really good overlap there. Now, morphic resonance may also apply to buildings, not because buildings are self-organizing and have their own life. The very fact that they're organized by builders and architects shows that they don't just grow by themselves. If they did, there wouldn't be any need for the Architectural Association. But I think buildings can have a kind of memory, because when I enter a particular room, or when you enter a particular room, say this room, everyone who's been in this room has the same set of stimuli to their sensory system, the same windows, the same patterns, the same shapes, the same proportions. And so I think we'd come into morphic resonance with those who've been in the same space before. And I think this has noticeable effects. I think if it comes out in ordinary everyday life when people go looking at houses. They want to buy a house and they're going around different houses, and people say, oh, I didn't like that one, it had a terribly gloomy atmosphere, or that seemed such a sunny and cheerful home, and so on. So people, when it actually comes to the crunch, do pay attention to these things, and in extreme cases where really bad things have happened, you may even get hauntings. Almost all stories of hauntings are associated with stories of something bad that's happened there. And the converse is also the case. When you have places that have been visited, particularly holy places that have been visited by people on spiritual journeys like pilgrimages, then you often have a really powerful atmosphere in that place, which is added to by further pilgrims. And is where I think when you enter one of these holy places, you can feel something about the atmosphere of that place, which I think is coming through tuning into the memory of those who've been there in the past. And this, of course, is true not of any particular religion, it's true in general. I mean, I've been to many Hindu temples, I've been to great mosques, wonderful Islamic tombs. Here in England, I'm particularly keen on cathedrals, and part of the revival of pilgrimage, which is going on at the present in a big way all through Europe, is very much about reconnecting with the archetype of the pilgrim journey, the journey with a purpose, and arriving in a holy place. It's a very deep archetype. It's found in all religions and all cultures, and I think it's rooted in the activities of our hunter-gatherer ancestors who were always moving in annual cycles towards places of great significance with their own stories, like in the Australian songlines of the Aborigines. So I think that pilgrimage is a modern expression of this, both the archetypal journey and also the coming to the holy place, which has this particular power through the fact it's been treated as a holy place by so many people for so long. And of course, some of these places had special qualities to start with. The people who are into geomancy or feng shui would say that many of them have, the place itself has a particular property. It could be a mountain top, there might be underground rivers there, and so on. There might be qualities in the place where the building is built. So you get both the power of the place geographically and historically. Morphic resonance also applies to rituals. I discuss this in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, because there are many spiritual practices, and now they've been investigated scientifically, many of them. It turns out they have measurable effects. All spiritual practices have measurable effects, scientifically measurable effects. And if you look at the thousands of studies that have now been conducted, the overall conclusion is that, generally speaking, they make people happier, healthier, and live longer. But one of the ways in which sound can affect us, for example, which is literal vibration, I think involves morphic resonance as well. My wife, Jill Peirce, teaches singing and chanting, and has done this for many years. And I've learned a lot from her about it. And what she points out is that when you chant a particular sound, if it's just a syllable, like ah, there's a vibration in particular parts of the body, the literal vibration in the body, not some fanciful metaphysical vibration, but actual vibration. You can hear it when you block your ears and make different vowel sounds. I won't suggest you do it now, but you can try this at home. So there's different parts of the body vibrate. Then when you're chanting with other people, then you're chanting together, so you're taking a breath at the same time, or if you're singing together, the same thing applies. Chanting is like a very simple song. So you're chanting together and making the same sounds as other people. You come into resonance with other people, which has a connecting effect, and it usually makes people feel much more connected and much happier. I've seen this with Joel's workshops, where people arrive as strangers at the beginning of the workshop, and by the end of the workshop, they're sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as a result of chanting together for 2 days. It has a remarkable effect. And that's, of course, why it's used in all religious traditions. Gregorian chant, singing in churches, Sufi chanting, Hindu chants. I mean, there's bhajan singing. It's used in all traditions, including in secular settings too, of course. But there's another dimension to this, that if you chant a particular mantra or sacred syllable or word, then by chanting it, you'll enter into morphic resonance with all those who've chanted the same mantra before. And there'll be a transmission across time. And in some Hindu and Buddhist traditions, like in Tibet, some of the mantras are very secret. People are transmitted this mantra by the guru, the teacher, and they're told not to tell anyone about it because it would weaken its power. Because if you chant it, if the only people who do it are chanting it within that particular tradition, you tune in by chanting it not only to yourself doing it in the past, but to other practitioners in that tradition, right back to the first time the mantra was chanted. So the chanting of liturgical chanting, the chanting of mantras, involves literal physical resonance, but also, I think, morphic resonance. And this is one of the things that gives these practices their power. And I think the same applies to rituals. All societies have rituals, and many rituals are reenactments of some primordial event in that culture. For example, the Jewish Feast of the Passover is a reenactment of the original Passover dinner in Egypt, when the angel of destruction passed over and killed the firstborn of the Egyptian and their cattle. The Jewish people were spared because they'd sacrificed a lamb and smeared blood on the doorway. And so they were passed over. And this event, the reenactment of that first Passover dinner, happens at Passover every year. And the story is told to those who participate in it. And by taking part in this ritual, people are not only connected with other people in the ritual at the same time, the group that's doing it together, but with all those who've done it before them. And so there's a connection across time, right back through past generations of Jewish people to the first Passover. And the Christian Holy Communion, itself a Passover dinner, is very similar. People who take Holy Communion in a ritual setting are connected with the other participants in that particular church or ceremony, but also connected by morphic resonance with all those who've done it before, right back to the first time. And this applies not only to religious rituals, but to secular ones. The American Thanksgiving dinner, for example, is a reenactment of the original Thanksgiving dinner of the settlers in North America around 1619, when they survived their first year, and gave thanks in a kind of harvest Thanksgiving in their first Thanksgiving dinner. This is reenacted every year by Americans. People become American by taking part in this ceremony and identifying with this tradition. So the ritual gives identity that connects you beyond yourself to something much greater than yourself, a whole tradition. And this is true of rituals in all cultures. And I think that they only make sense, really, in the light of morphic resonance. Otherwise, from a kind of rationalistic point of view, people are just wasting time doing mumbo-jumbo, repetitive actions and so forth. But if you see it through the lens of kind of mechanistic rationalism, that's how you'd see it. I dare say that's how Richard Dawkins would see it. But if you see it through the lens of morphic resonance, it makes great sense. And these different cultures, who've all independently arrived at this principle, are doing so because it works. They're not doing it because there's a universal dogma applying to all cultures. It's because cultures have independently discovered this, and it's found all over the world, these patterns of ritual chanting and rituals. Then, of course, ceremonies, festivals, annual festivals are similar to rituals. It's a repetitive pattern that connects the whole community to nature and to previous participants in those ceremonies over the years. Finally, I just want to say a few words about evolution, because morphic resonance gives the idea of habits and the repetition of habits. But that alone won't explain evolution. Something new has to happen in evolution. So I think evolution is an interplay between habit and creativity. The creativity occurs, we don't know how. There's many theories of creativity, but creativity happens at every level: the molecular level, the genetic level, the organism adapting level, the human level, technical inventions, patents, new ideas, new tunes, new architectural forms. There are many kinds of creativity, and creativity is often prodigious. When organisms mutate, because of radiation, for example, they may produce hundreds of different forms, mutant forms, but most of them aren't viable, they die out. Only a few survive, and through repetition, they become more habitual by morphic resonance. So there's a creativity happening all through nature and all through human life. Then there's a kind of natural selection of what works in that context, what is repeated. And anything that's repeated will be repeated more by morphic resonance and become more probable and more likely the more often it's repeated. So I think to understand the evolutionary process, morphic resonance alone isn't enough. There has to be a creative principle as well. And as I say, there are a range of theories of creativity. I won't go into them now because time's up, but I could go into it later if you're interested, but they're inconclusive because you can't actually prove any of these theories. Morphic resonance could be proved, and people with different creativity theories could agree on morphic resonance, but might have different theories of creativity. Is it just chance? Is it because of some divine creative principle? And everything in between. Anyway, that's an overview of the idea of morphic resonance, and as you see, it has many implications. It fits into a view of the universe as being holistically organized with different levels, each level more than the sum of the parts. Morphic resonance underlies the activity of minds, and mental fields underlie our mental habits. But it doesn't explain everything, and as I just said, one thing it doesn't explain is creativity. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, just as a summary to give you a taste of these ideas. Thank you.
I've heard you talk about also in a more concrete way of explaining some of these fields and these phenomena and morphic resonance, as you coined it. You also talked about pregnant women with their babies. I thought this was quite an amazing study that you took out. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was part of. Is this working? Yes. That was.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Well, that was part of research on telepathy. I didn't talk about my work on telepathy this evening, owing to the limits of time, but I can briefly summarize some of it. The members of social groups, like flocks of birds, I think are coordinated through a field of the whole group. When you look at a murmuration of starlings, hundreds of thousands of birds in these flocks can change direction almost simultaneously without bumping into each other. How do they do it? Even if they were able to see their neighbors and observe their movements in enormous detail, it wouldn't tell them where their neighbors are going to go. And they might collide otherwise, but they don't. So I think that social groups have morphic fields which coordinate the members of the group. And it's most obvious in flocks of birds and schools of fish. But when you have packs of animals like wolves, social animals, I think these fields continue to coordinate them even when they move apart. So when the adult wolves go hunting, ranging over hundreds of miles, leave the cubs in the den with a babysitter, the bonds between them, caused by this, the morphic field that links them together, the bonds are not broken, they remain connected. And so a change in one can affect the others at a distance. And I think that's the basis of telepathy. I think it works by a resonance through the morphic field of the social group. And telepathy literally means distant feeling. And I think it's very, very widespread in the animal realm. When I got interested in telepathy because of its relation to morphic fields, I started with animals because I thought, well, if it exists, it's not some higher faculty of the advanced human mind. It's some basic biological faculty that animals might be better at. So I started asking people with dogs and cats and thinking about my own animals that I've kept over the years, and realized there's countless examples on every side. The phenomenon I concentrated on most, because it's easiest to do experiments on, is dogs that know when their owners are coming home. About 50% of dogs go and wait at a door or window when the person they're most bonded to is on the way home, and the people at home know when they're coming as a result. And this happens even if people have jobs that are irregular times, and no one's very surprised if it's the same time every day, it's a routine. But when many people have irregular return times, dogs still do it. It gets more interesting. And when it happens when dogs still do it, when people are in taxis or in a friend's car or other unfamiliar vehicles or traveling by public transport, it gets even more interesting. And I think it's an example of telepathy. So I've done experiments where we film the dog the whole time the person's out. We have them come home at random times in unfamiliar vehicles. And you can, from the objective measurement of observing the film, you can show that the dog still anticipates their return 20 minutes, half an hour in advance in some cases. You can find this described in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and all the peer-reviewed papers on this on my website under the heading called Animal Powers. All this is published in peer-reviewed journals. So now coming back to when I was giving a talk on dogs that know when their owners are coming home in New York years ago, a woman in the audience said, well, do you think something like that would happen between mothers and babies, that mothers would know when the baby needs them? And I then started asking, I mean, obviously I've not had the experience of being a nursing mother myself, but so I started asking women who nursed children, including my own wife, and I found this was a common experience, that people, when they go back to work or start leaving a baby after 2 or 3 months, they're still breastfeeding, they may be miles away, and women feel their milk let down. Their breast starts squeezing out milk. Many women experience the breast tingling. And so this would be an obvious case of a very biological form of telepathy, because in the course of evolution, until the invention of phones in the last 100 years, any mother who could feel when her baby needed her and would go to the baby would have a baby that had a better chance of surviving than a mother who couldn't feel it. So I then carried out a study in North London with nursing mothers, recruited 20 nursing mothers, and this was done about 20 years ago. We had notebooks, so the babysitter wrote down whenever the baby cried and showed signs of distress. The mother wrote down whenever her milk let down, when she was at work or shopping or away from home. And we then had an independent statistical analysis showing that this was hugely significant. The coincidence, the mother's milk let down, coincided with the baby's distress, about 1 billion times more often than you'd expect by pure chance. And it wasn't just a matter of routine feeding times either. So that was a study I did then, and since I'm always on the lookout for a way of repeating it today, I'll mention it here now, since you give me this opportunity to plug my new experiment, which is I'm looking for people who have nursing mothers with babies who are going back to work and starting to leave the baby, because nowadays many people have video baby monitors. So instead of people writing down in pencil in a notebook, you could have a video baby monitor that actually records when the baby shows signs of distress with the time code built in. Most mothers now have smartphones, and when they feel their milk let down, they could do a selfie saying, "My milk's letting down now." And then if you put them split screen, and you see the baby waking up and starting to cry, and the mother at the same time miles away saying, "My milk's letting down now," put that on YouTube and it would go viral very, very quickly. And that no one's done this study. I've tried to persuade people at colleges of midwifery and nursing to do this study, but telepathy, like morphic resonance, is so taboo that people are worried about their careers or their grants or their reputation by doing any research on it. It's really frustrating to find so many areas of science that are really interesting, where it's almost impossible to get the research done because of social barriers. The other experiment on telepathy I might mention is with telephone telepathy. This is by far the commonest kind in the modern world. 85% of people, according to surveys, have had the experience of thinking of someone for no apparent reason. Then they ring and they say, it's funny, I was just thinking of you. Or knowing who it is when the phone rings before looking at caller ID or picking it up and answering it. Very, very common. And for 100 years, the so-called skeptics have dismissed this by saying, oh, well, there's nothing but coincidence and wishful thinking. People think about others all the time. Occasionally one of them rings and they imagine it's telepathy, but they just forget the millions of times they're wrong. Well, they got away with that argument for 100 years, preventing research by saying, oh, there's nothing to investigate. But when we actually did experiments on this, it turns out that it's real. How we do the experiments is we find people who say this happens quite often. They sit in a room at home with a landline phone and no caller ID. We film them. They give us the names of 4 people they know well who they might be telepathic with. Because telepathy happens mostly with people you know very well that you're socially bonded with. And we pick one of the 4 at random by the throw of a die or a random number generator, ring them up and ask them to call the subject. And the phone rings, the person then has to say to the camera who they think is ringing. I think it's Tim. Hi, Tim. They're right or wrong. By chance, they'd be right 25% of the time, 1 in 4 guessing. In these experiments with hundreds of trials, they're right about 45% of the time. It's massively significant statistically, about as significant as the existence of the Higgs boson. So I think I now have apps that I'm developing a new one at the moment that work on smartphones where you can do these tests just as part of ordinary everyday life. So I think the thing is that with telepathy, it's almost everyone's experienced it with mobile phones. Most people have experienced it in other contexts. Many women have experienced it. Most people have experienced it with their dogs. And if you talk to most people, they all have their own stories. Any of you who doubt this can try it by bring it up with friends or family members. And I predict that most people will tell you stories about their own experiences. And yet, within the academic and scientific world, there's a complete taboo on this, a complete denial that this is possible. And most so-called skeptics won't look at the evidence because they think it's impossible. It's impossible because the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain and is therefore confined to the inside of the head. Therefore, my thoughts can't possibly influence someone hundreds of miles away. And so they literally refuse to look at the evidence because they're so convinced it's impossible, so the evidence must be flawed. So it's an extraordinary cultural divide that all of us experience, actually, because if you talk to normal friends or family members in an informal setting, you'll find most people completely accept these things exist. Yet, enter an academic institution, especially a scientific one, and you'll find you can't talk about it, at least during working hours, without attracting it might be just imaginary disapproval. People actually pretend to disapprove even though they've had these experiences themselves. And whenever I give talks in scientific institutions about these things, afterwards I almost always have the experience of some person will come up and they look to see no one's listening over the drinks or the tea. And they'll say, well, I've had these experiences myself. I always know when my wife's ringing, or my dog always knows when I'm coming home from the lab and stuff. But I can't tell my colleagues, they're all so straight. And then a minute or two later, another one comes up, says almost the same thing. And so I say to them, well, actually, I know that all your colleagues aren't so straight, and because 4 or 5 have already told me this evening that they have these experiences. And so sometimes I just say to the whole group, why don't you guys come out? Because you'd have so much more fun.
I'm going to ask just one more, because I'm just aware that there's time and there's probably some questions in the room, but you talk a lot about this, this resonance being based off of similarity. So, we're able to resonate with our past self through this collective memory. But I wonder, does that resonance also occur on an interspecies basis? I know you've done this work with, us being telepathic with dogs as well. But I wonder how far you think that actually extends, this similarity, and what are we actually similar with? What can we resonate across? And if this is resonating across time and this is a collective memory, and we're not just resonating with the past, are we also able to resonate with the future? How does the future come in contact with this idea of collective memory?
Okay, well, there's two questions here, really. The similarity one I see as a kind of empirical question. Now, if you train rats of one variety to learn a new trick and you get a morphic resonance effect, then try other varieties of rat, more or less closely related, and see how far it spreads over. I think that it's fairly... Certain things, like if you look at breeds of dogs, for example, many young sheepdogs try herding other animals without any training at all. It's so deeply instinctive. But that doesn't happen with poodles, for example. So there seems to be more specific tuning. And gun dogs, which have been trained to retrieve pheasants and things on shoots, behave completely different from dogs of other breeds. Most dogs, when they hear a gun go off near them, are terrified, not surprisingly. However, young gun dogs, some of them at least, even if they've never heard a gun before, when they hear a gun go off, they raise their head excitedly. They don't know quite what they're looking for, but it would be a fallen pheasant or something. So it must be quite specific within dogs. So for me, that's just an empirical question. How similar is similar? You could argue about it sort of academically for a long time, but really the question is what matters for morphic resonance. It may not be the same as what matters for us when we're classifying things or observing them. And then resonance, the hypothesis is based on the idea that time is asymmetrical. There's an asymmetry between the past and the future, which we all, of course, experience, and which is also true in the whole cosmology that we have. The Big Bang, at the Big Bang, the universe was very small and very hot, and it's been expanding and cooling down ever since. So there's an arrow of time in the whole universe. It's not like some physics models like Einstein's block universe where time makes no difference. The reason some physicists get to the idea that time makes no difference is because they're so Platonic. They believe in eternal laws of nature which never change. And therefore, it's more or less irrelevant what order things happen in. The real reality for them is laws of nature that don't change. But if we have a radical asymmetry of time in the universe, and of course in our own experience, we all grow up from being embryos and fertilized eggs, embryos, and then we grow up. We don't grow down and become younger and younger and finally end up as a fertilized egg. So there's a built-in asymmetry, and I think morphic resonance is from the past. And I don't think it happens from the future. It would be almost impossible to test because you'd never know what's going to happen in the future. So it's a postulate. However, I do think that there can be influences from the future. I mean, precognitive dreams are a reality. There are influences from the future, but I don't think they're in the same category as morphic resonance. I think they're working within consciousness if they're over a period of several days or weeks, through dreams and things like that, which I think is part of the realm of possibility that morphic resonance doesn't cover. Consciousness is a realm of possibility, and morphic resonance is a realm of unconscious habit. And so I think in that realm of consciousness, which is also where creativity can happen, I think there are links with the future, but they're not terribly reliable because we don't have precognitive dreams about everything that's going to happen. They're exceptional, and even if you pay real attention to them, they're not about everything all the time. So I think there are these connections with the future, but they're not morphic resonance.
Cool, well, I'll open up the floor. Quite a few questions already. I think Harriet's going to help me out with the mic, so yeah, let's take one over here. think there's a mic behind you if you need.
10 days ago, I went to the theatre in the West End to a magician, and he did some remarkable things. One of them was that he actually managed to hypnotize more than 50% of the 1,000 people in the audience. Almost instantaneously, and I was one of them, and it made me completely forget an episode which I must have seen because they replayed it on a film afterwards. So my question is hypnosis morphic resonance or telepathy?
It's a really difficult question because no one really knows how hypnosis works, despite the fact it's been known about ever since Mesmer and probably before. It's very mysterious how hypnosis works, and I don't know of any satisfactory theory. Various people have tried to explain it. But there is some of the very earliest experiments on telepathy were done under hypnosis by a surgeon in the East India Company called Esdale, who found that he could hypnotize patients before doing operations and carry out operations in the 1840s and 50s, before anesthetics were invented. He was doing operations in Bengal with patients under hypnotic anesthesia. And he said that when people came to thank him, as they did, he then asked them to take part in an experiment. He hypnotized them, and then he was behind a screen, and a servant gave him, in a random order, a series of flavors: chocolate, banana, salt, different tastes of chili, which he'd put in his mouth. And then he'd ask the hypnotized person what flavors they felt. And they reported feeling the flavors that he was actually experiencing, the tastes. He called it community of sensation. And I think that could be a morphic resonance effect under hypnosis. And so I think there is a relationship. I don't think hypnosis itself is a morphic resonance effect, or it could be. You could say that the hypnotized people fall into a kind of resonance with previously hypnotized people. There's a whole field of hypnosis. That's quite possible. But Esdale's experiments on community of sensation are the ones that strike me as being closest to morphic resonance, because they're, as it were, resonating with his experience when they couldn't have known by any other means. I've been trying to persuade people to repeat that experiment. In fact, I once got Paul McKenna to hypnotize various people and persuaded him to put bits of banana and chocolate in his mouth and see if they felt it. It didn't work very well, partly because he hadn't got long. He was rushing off to some other show. And so it was all done in a very hurried and unsatisfactory way. But it would be really good to repeat Esdale's experiments at some stage. The frustrating thing about this field of research is so many things that you can do that would be really interesting, which don't get done because of these taboos. One of the reasons I wrote my book, The Science Delusion, about the 10 dogmas of contemporary science, is that I think in many areas of science, free inquiry is inhibited by dogmatic taboos, and that science would be regenerated and become so much more interesting if we could just get on with looking at things empirically and testing hypotheses instead of sticking to an ideological line. And hypnosis is under a shadow. It's not exactly denied because it's undeniable, but it's not something that any ambitious scientist would do research on if they value their career. It's one of those areas, what you do if you value your career is brain scanning and molecular studies on nerve cells and that kind of thing. So I wish there were a clear answer, but there isn't.
Thanks. Okay, so maybe we'll take one over here, just to kind of balance out. Oh no, we've got a mic already. Sorry.
Hi,
we'll come to you after.
Over here. I was very interested to read about how in ancient India the temple architects would be very much tested on their spiritual stability, emotional stability, and mental stability before they were allowed to actually create anything. And I feel it's very relevant to this topic of morphic resonance. And wondering if you can speak a little about the responsibility you feel we hold as architects and designers in the morphic resonances we create through the work that we do, in what we impregnate as part of ourselves into what is created through us.
Well, I suppose that people building sacred buildings in the past took this task very seriously, including the people who built the great cathedrals, you know, in Europe. We live in a completely secularized world now, where lots of people have no religious beliefs or followings, and if they're spiritual but not religious, they keep it quiet. It's like a private hobby. So I suppose it's not really very much part of the culture of any profession today, including the architectural profession. But I certainly think that we might see better and more harmonious buildings if this were part of the training, but that would probably involve lengthening the course at the AA by a year or two, and the practical difficulties might be. I'm not in architectural education, so I can't imagine what they are. I'm sure there would be some, but I think it's true of any walk of life in any profession that if people are doing it from a spiritual point of view, seeing it as part of service to others and in connection with the greater whole and the greater good, the results are more likely to be harmonious and helpful to others than if they're just doing it for ego-based reasons or greed or fame or whatever. So anyway, I can't say anything specifically about architects, but I think these general principles would apply to architects as well as to others.
Thank you. Could we get a mic over to this? Oh, sorry. Could we come to the green shirt afterwards as well? Just, you can ask your question, but maybe just second one, yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, thank you for the lecture. I wanted to ask what you make of Lynn Margulis's Symbiogenesis with regards to evolution by association, and secondly, with regards to Vipassana as a meditative practice that in practice revolves around developing awareness of your own form, which has multiple mental and physical implications, which are kind of complicated to go over.
Well, Lynn Margulis, for those who are not familiar with her theory, pointed out years ago, I've forgotten how many years ago, at least 30 or 40 years ago, that if you look at the organelles, these little structures inside cells, mitochondria, which we have, they produce energy inside our cells, and chloroplasts in plant cells, the bits that do the photosynthesis. These exist inside membranes, or they're semi-autonomous, they have their own DNA. And she suggested that these were originally free-living bacteria or microbes that were engulfed by larger cells, but instead of being digested, which they normally are, I mean, amoeba, for example, goes around engulfing bacteria and digesting them. But some of them avoided being digested and went on living symbiotically within the cell. And the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts, according to Lynn Margulis, was through this symbiotic evolution. I find that completely persuasive, particularly in view of the molecular evidence that they're more like microbes than they are like higher plant or animal cells. And it doesn't present any problem for a morphic resonance theory because, as I showed, that model of holistic organization, wholes at all levels contain parts which are themselves autonomous to some degree, and which themselves contain parts. So it's wholes within wholes within wholes. And so including mitochondria or chloroplasts, originally symbiotic microorganisms within a cell, would fit very well with that model of how cells work. So that was part one. There was a second part to the question. Remind me.
Concerning a form of meditation called
meditation.
Vipassana. Yeah.
Well, there are two main kinds of meditation. One is the mindfulness or type, of which Vipassana is one. The other is mantra-based meditation. And I think that what's happening there is that by having a focus for attention other than our normal ruminative thoughts, by focusing either on the mantra or on the breathing or sensations in and around the body, we provide another focus for attention, and that takes away some of the power of, we detach ourselves from the normal train of thoughts that are going on in our minds, which are now known to be connected with what's called the default mode network, a series of brain activities that linked up together that are involved in this default ruminative thought, or just sort of chatter of the mind that goes on when we're not doing anything in particular. I think what's powerful about these meditation techniques is that it detaches us from being completely sucked into these thoughts which we identify as being ourselves, and we see that actually there's our minds are not totally under our own control. There's a level at which the minds are deeper than the thoughts going through them. And I think that's a key part of many religious understandings of the world as well, because the model of divine consciousness that we find in the Hindu tradition, and the Buddhist one's slightly trickier, but in the Hindu tradition and the Christian tradition, have the idea that the ultimate consciousness has three main aspects. There's the ground of consciousness itself, which Hindus call Sat, being, conscious being in the present. Then there's Chit, which is the contents of consciousness, which the Hindus call names and forms, nama rupa. What goes through our minds are names and forms. We see, as we look around us, endless forms that we recognize and can give names to. And the world is full of forms. And those are the contents of consciousness. Without a mind, we couldn't see or recognize them. But they're separable from the mind that's doing the recognizing. Just as a mirror is not the same, it's a famous Dzogchen image in Tibetan Buddhism. The mirror is not the same as all the things that you can see in it. So the fundamental nature of the mind is to be conscious being in the present. And we come closer to that through meditation when we let go of these various thoughts that are constantly going through our minds. So I'd see meditation as it's a spiritual practice which gives us a sense of the nature of our own consciousness. And although many people in the modern world do meditation to stop them being frazzled after a hard day's work or a hard day's shopping, it's been completely secularized in many modern presentations. The reason it exists in the Christian contemplative tradition with monks and nuns, and in the Tibetan and the Theravada Buddhist, and in the Hindu traditions, and in the Sufi tradition, is because the idea is that our mind is of the same nature as the divine or ultimate mind, and by experiencing the nature of our own minds, we become closer to the ultimate mind from which all minds are ultimately derived. Now, for a secular meditator, for some, it's just things going on inside their head that don't relate to anything out there, because there is nothing out there in terms of consciousness. But I think for most people who practice meditation, there's a sense in which you're connecting with something greater than yourself. And that's what all spiritual practices are about, really, connecting with something greater than yourself, a consciousness greater than your own.
Thanks. I think there was another one here.
Hi, Rupert. Thank you very much. Really interesting talk. I was just wondering I suppose it's quite a simple question, but if you could elaborate more on the difference between how certain species or even particular organisms within a particular species group might be more susceptible or more inclined to these kind of abilities to communicate with each other. You know, like how 50% of the audience were able to be hypnotized, for example, in this chap's story. Yeah.
Well, I think that within social species, the telepathic abilities play a very important role in connecting members of the group at a distance. But there are some species that aren't social. Most reptiles are not very social. You know, turtles will swim to an island like Ascension Island in the middle of the ocean, lay their eggs, and then just swim off again. And the baby turtles, when they hatch out from the egg, you have no parent to look after them or feed them or protect them. So in many species of reptile, I wouldn't expect there to be very much telepathy. And in fact, when I was doing my research on telepathy in animals, I tried to identify good cases of reptile telepathy, and I found it very hard to find any. Nearly all the cases I have are with mammals, dogs, cats, some with sheep, a lot with horses, or birds, parrots, parakeets, budgerigars, magpies, jackdaws, other animals kept a domesticated form. But very, very few with reptiles. And I did try. I mean, I had appeals for information in the various journals that I thought would reach the right target audience, like Reptilian International. Despite these appeals for information, I had very, very few cases. The only really convincing case is from an American burlesque dancer who dances with a boa constrictor, and she has formed this tight bond with it, and it enjoys it literally. She said that when she travelled without the snake, she left it with a friend, and said the snake always seemed to buck up and know when she was coming home. So it's one of the very few cases, and I haven't got any convincing cases of psychic goldfish either, despite trying to find examples. So I think it's mainly social animals that do this. And if you look at humans, we're of course social animals. We live in a society, in a secularized world, where these phenomena are not studied by most scientists. They're taboo within the educational system. You know, if you ask a science teacher at school about these things, they'll probably just say, oh, they're non-existent, or they're not being proved, or not enough evidence yet, if they want to be neutral sounding. But not encouraged. Whereas in traditional societies, it's taken for granted that these skills exist, and people pay attention to them and cultivate them. When I lived in India, I just found that almost all Indians took these things for granted. It wasn't a matter of, as soon as someone told a story of this kind, someone would sit back and say, aha, but are you sure it wasn't just a coincidence? Or how do you know it wasn't a subtle cue? Or, you know, all the standard off-the-shelf skeptical objections we've been trained to bring up in these situations. And so in many parts of the world, Africa, India, Brazil, these things are very widely taken for granted in the culture and are probably cultivated a lot more than they are in our society. And then, of course, there are individual differences, even in Africa and India and Brazil. There are people who are better at this than others. There are individual differences in every human skill. Some people are more musical than others. Others have a better sense of smell or hearing than others. So it's not surprising there are differences in telepathic sensitivity in animals and in people. I suppose what is surprising is that in our society, despite official denial, no training whatever, dismissal of these experiences by educated people, despite all that, they haven't gone away. In fact, they're on the increase because the widespread use of mobile phones now means that people are in contact with others all the time. And telepathy is very much on the increase in the modern world, both in connection with phone calls, text messages, and emails, because we now have these technological means of immediate communication. So far from going away, they're actually becoming more predominant and more common in people's lives. And yet, the official worldview hasn't caught up with that yet.
Sorry, can I just... And would you say that maybe in India, because like people are quite literally enhancing their morphic resonance by being more open-minded to it, so therefore they're better at it than perhaps in other Western societies?
Yes, I think people are more open-minded, they pay more attention to it. When it happens, they don't deny it. And so it encourages these abilities to develop. And if you, for example, the Vandana Shiva, the environmentalist, told me that when she was a child, her father was a forest officer and was working in forest areas way beyond the reach of the Indian telephone system. So when she was going home from school, she was at boarding school, she couldn't tell them exactly when she'd arrive. Sometimes she'd stay with friends for a day or two afterwards, and it all depended on getting reservations on trains and irregular bus services and so forth. So it was all rather unpredictable. She didn't even try to tell them when she'd be arriving. But when she got home, her mother had got her room ready, had cooked her favorite meal. It was all ready for her when she arrived, because her mother just knew when she was coming home, like dogs knowing when their owners are coming home. The mother knew when her daughter was coming home. And so I said to Vandana Shiva, you know, did she see this remarkable or as remarkable, or did any of your family see it as remarkable? She said, no, we just took it for granted. She's a mother. I'm her daughter. Of course she'd know when I'm coming home. And so in those sort of circumstances where it's taken for granted as part of the culture, then it's much easier for these things to happen than if you're an educated person, you mention it to friends or family members and they feel they've got to try and deny it or debunk it and try and prove it's not really happening to prove they're educated. So it's a very different culture. And I think that it's definitely more favorable.
Thanks. There are some more questions. I think we'll probably go for like maybe 5 to 10 more minutes, and there's going to be some drinks, and we'll just have some music. So any more questions? Yeah, we're going to go here, and then we're going to go over here.
Hello. When you first went to India, what were your colleagues referring to morphic resonance as?
Well, when I first went to India, I was working in an international institute, so my British and American colleagues were a little bit like my colleagues in Cambridge. They sort of felt that they had to be skeptical. But I found that working in agriculture was very refreshing compared with working in molecular biology in Cambridge. Agriculturalists, on the whole, are pragmatic. They're interested in what works, and they don't know how most things work in plant breeding or in disease resistance or whatever. And so they're much less ideological. Whereas people who are professors or would-be professors at Cambridge are much more concerned with being scientifically correct and not saying something that's the wrong theory or something. So I found that I found in general with botanists and agriculturalists, they're much less ideological and much less prone to just denialism. But among my Hindu colleagues, I found that almost all of them found morphic resonance perfectly acceptable. In fact, they welcomed the idea because they all believed in reincarnation. And there's nothing in modern genetics that enables you to believe in reincarnation. If all inheritance depends on genes just being passed down from parents to children, then how could somebody who lived in a different village with a different family background be reincarnated in another body? Like the Dalai Lama in Tibet, the stream of 14 Dalai Lamas have not been closely related to each other. In fact, they've been completely unrelated. And one of the tests they do when they're finding a new Lama is show them objects that belong to the previous Lama, which they remember. And they show them a range of bells or hats or whatever, one of which belonged to the previous Lama, and the others are decoys. They didn't belong to the previous Lama, who they're supposed to be the reincarnation of. And in these empirical tests, if they pick out the right objects over and over again, then it's one of the things that enables them to be recognized as a reincarnation. So reincarnation involves a transfer of memory from a previous life to a present one. Now, and morphic resonance could help to explain that. I think we tune into the memories of lots of other people, the collective memory, but there may be conditions in which you pick up one particular person more than others and may have memories from a particular person. And so that then could be, morphic resonance would help to explain that as a memory transfer. It wouldn't necessarily say you are that person. That would then be a theological question. Buddhists deny that the entire personality transmigrates, whereas Hindus think it does. So there's been an ongoing debate among Hindus and Buddhists about what exactly the transfer of memory involves. And we're not going to solve it here this evening. It's been going on for over 2,000 years. But morphic resonance enables the basic principles of karma, which is central to Hindu philosophy, action having effects. Karma, as expressed in reincarnation, does not have to involve a direct material continuity, but rather can involve influences leaping across time and space. So most Hindu scientists I talked to, my colleagues, were totally open to morphic resonance, and but they rather annoyingly, instead of thinking this is a good reason to start doing research and testing it, they just went on doing their conventional genetics and stuff during their day job, because that's how you get ahead in science. You don't question things, you just do what you're expected to do. And so when I tried to incite them to insurrectional research and do unconventional things, they were totally resistant to that. They wanted to keep their jobs, have an easy life, not provoke trouble, etc. Very understandable. And so when I said, well, look, then if people in India aren't going to try and do research on this, who is? And they said, oh, sooner or later it will be shown, and Western science is still in its infancy. They used to say to me, 50 years, 100 years, then it will be generally recognized that the ancient rishis were right all along and stuff. So they took this long-term view, which I find frustrating because it didn't mean they actually did anything. They just complacently identified these theories as being well-known, and they'd come into their own sooner or later. No doubt this was a wise and long-term view, but I was in a hurry to get experiments done.
Okay. I think we had some over here. I think, can we go to this person? I'll take the mic. Thank you.
I can speak loud.
Yeah? Okay.
Thank you.
Well, just in case.
Thank you very much for... I just want to say some couple of things. Thank you, Eddie, who invited me here. Thank you for you, Richard, to introducing the theory to me, the construct to me, and also to the organizing the event, obviously. Just want to ask you a question. What do you think is the role of morphic resonance into a structural change and ideological change? Because obviously they're two different things, and they work with different speed. Thank you.
The structural change, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
And ideological
change. Well, I think of ideologies, or indeed paradigms in science, as kind of morphic fields. They're habits of thought. And so, like all habits, they become deeply entrenched. An ideology becomes very deeply entrenched. We're, all of us, entrenched in the ideology of progress. Until about 400 years ago, 500 years ago, no one believed in progress through science and technology, and now every government in the world has been converted to this ideology of progress through science and technology, economic growth and development. It's an ideology which all of us are within. And there are people who question it by saying, well, why do we need growth? And we could have a no-growth economy, or we could have a circular economy instead of one that's always growing, etc. But the ideology is very, very deep-seated in institutions of government, education, in people's lives, in their own philosophies, and so forth. And the Marxist ideology was deeply embedded in the Soviet Union taught to all children, and they saw the world through, many of them saw the world through that lens. And the mechanistic materialist ideology is very deeply embedded within the scientific world. This is one of my problems, that I, trying to sort of suggest alternatives in various areas of science. But what I come up against over and over again is very deep-seated habits of thought, where people are convinced that the world fits this materialist model, not because they've thought about it, but because they haven't. So I think morphic resonance plays a very large part in social structure and in ideology in general. And then there comes the question, well, then how do you have change, and how do changes occur? And this is something, after all, which historians of ideas and sociologists have studied. So there is empirical data. But one thing that's important is to have an alternative. Most people aren't going to give up a worldview and replace it with nothing. They're only going to give it up if there's a plausible alternative. And right now there is a plausible alternative to the mechanistic materialist worldview in science, which is a holistic, integrative, evolutionary worldview where nature's more like an organism than a machine. And my own work is part of that, and in my book, The Science Delusion, I try to show how by breaking out of the dogmas of materialism, we could have a different worldview. Now, many people already have that different worldview, but the educational system is still inculcating the mechanistic materialist worldview, the GCSE science and A-level science, so give not a hint of change towards a more holistic perspective, nor do most university degree courses. So we're educating new generations of young people in the old paradigm, in fact brainwashing or indoctrinating them with it. And many of them don't go beyond it until they have a kind of midlife crisis and then start looking at alternative worldviews. So I think there has to be an alternative, and the alternative has to be attractive. People have to want to change worldview because it's better. As one of my American friends likes to say, if you want to change the world, throw a better party. I think that that's part of it. If you have a worldview which is more attractive, an ideology is more attractive, then more plausible, then there's more chance of people switching. But it's like switching channels on a TV set. It's like a paradigm shift, as Kuhn described them in science, was a shift from one worldview to a different worldview. It's not a kind of gradual change, it's rather a revolutionary change from one particular way of seeing things to another. And that's what scientific paradigms are. The classic example being the shift from the model with the Earth at the center to the model where the Earth and the other planets revolve around the sun, the Copernican revolution. You can't, you see it one way or you see it the other way. It's a shift in perspective or worldview. And I think that's what's going on at the moment. And we don't yet know, at least in the political area, there aren't any clear blueprints that I can see for an alternative to neoliberalism, or it's not as if we're all rallying around some visionary political leader who can see some whole new way forward. The only person in public life, I think, who clearly expresses a holistic, integrative worldview is our king, who for years has been very much part of this shift in paradigm to a more holistic and integrative worldview. I think we're very fortunate we have a king who embodies these ideas, but they're not yet working their way through the educational, the political system to any great degree, in my opinion.
Thanks. I'm being told that we're kind of out of time, and we want to have a little bit of time for drinks and just kind of relaxing, winding down the evening. I'm sure Rupert's going to be around for a little bit longer. He's got some books here. And I'd just like to thank everyone for coming and listening. I know it's been quite long, there's a lot of dense ideas. I'd really encourage you to interact more with Rupert's work if you don't know it. And if you'd like to join me in just thanking Rupert for coming, that'd be great.